Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
You've gone from a position where you're very skeptical about any psychic or any medium to where you're seeking psychics for validation.
Right. But in about the dozen psychics that I went to, none of them seemed to have the ability to make accurate past life matches. And then I was introduced to Kevin Ryerson.
Yes.
And Kevin channels a spirit guide named Atun-Re.
Yes, who claims to be an ancient Egyptian priest.
Who last lived about 3,500 years ago. And, I went through my proposed matches, and Atun-Re said that I was right in about 85% of the cases and wrong in 15% of the cases. So I went name by name, and he told me which ones were right, which ones were wrong. He validated my past lifetime, but I still didn't know how can I trust Atun-Re? Yeah. How do I know he's accurate?
Now, and let me pause for a moment, because as a parapsychologist in general, and as a friend of Kevin Ryerson, I'm quite confident in his sincerity in what he does, and not only that, in his talent. Yeah. But for me, I view a great psychic like I might think of a great baseball player, like Babe Ruth. Was one of the greatest baseball players of all times, but he did strike out more often than he hit a home run.
Right, so, and that's a valid point, that even good psychics have a hit rate.
Yeah.
And some are more accurate than others. Yeah. And if we have time, we can talk about the work of Gary Schwartz, who has done work to try to validate psychics.
Professor at the University of Arizona. And of course, there's 150 years of research in psychical research and parapsychology. We have a vast body of data about this right now. So
what I started to do is ask Atun-Re questions about what we would call blind cases.
Okay.
It's one thing if you hypothesize a past life match.
Yeah.
Let's say that Bill Clinton, for instance, I hypothesize was Peyton Randolph, who was the first president, the president of the first Continental Congress. Yes. Then Atun-Re just has to say yes or no. But I start to ask about people where I had absolutely no idea who they were. And like Ralph Nader is a good example.
Right.
And Atun-Re said that Nader was part of the American Revolution. He played a prominent role in the Continental Congress. And if you find his portrait, you'll see the same angular facial features. And I said, what's the name? And he said, the name is Thompson. Well, that's very specific information.
Yes,
Thompson, Continental Congress, I should be able to find him. Well, by this time, I had my own library on the American Revolution. And I looked through all the indices of all the books I had. I could not find a Thompson. And I almost gave up on it. But then I thought, by this time I had a book contract and had a deadline. And so I thought, I don't have time to do this anymore. But I thought I'd give it one more shot. And I went to the San Francisco Public Library and went through every book on the American Revolution that they had, just looking in the indices for a Thompson. Finally, in a book that was published around 1935, it was a huge black volume, in the index it says Thompson, Charles Thompson, portrait of Thompson. I turn to the page, and it's a dead ringer for Ralph Nader.
And we can show that image.
Yeah. And then now that it turns out that he was the secretary of the Continental Congress for the full 13 years of its existence. And the reason he wasn't in most history books is they recorded who the elected representatives were. And not many people focused on the secretary. But now that I had more information, I was able to get more information on them, and found that they said the same things. They were both advocates for the underdogs. They were both advocates for Native American rights. And the history, you might ask if Thompson was a revolutionary who served as the Secretary of the Congress for 13 years, why didn't he get elected as a representative himself? And what the history book said was that he was too radical to be elected, just like Nader. And then I start to ask about other personalities. For instance, I had read about another Philadelphia revolutionary named David Rittenhouse, and all I knew is that he helped edit the pamphlet Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. That's all I knew about him. And I asked Atun Ray, has this Rittenhouse reincarnated? And he said, well, yeah, he was Carl Sagan. Sagan had died by this time. Excuse me, but at first thought, when Atun Ray told me that, my heart sank, because I thought that can't be true. Because by this time I had realized people pretty much do the same things in life. And politicians tend to come back as politicians, artists come back as artists, doctors come back as doctors. And I thought, how could this little known revolutionary that I had never heard of become the world's most famous astronomer? And this was before the internet. We're talking about 2001, and the internet was in its infancy.
It was in its very early stages.
There were some very primitive search engines, but nobody used them.
I think it's fair to say that Kevin Ryerson probably didn't search the internet on this case.
And when I go to sessions, I don't tell Kevin ahead of time what I'm going to ask. So then I got other books, and lo and behold, 2 months later, I got a book that said that, where I learned that Rittenhouse was America's first astronomer. And he built the first telescope in America. He built the first replica of the solar system that was accurate based on his observations.
And you didn't even know this when you first inquired.
And I still didn't know what he looked like. The book